Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. If these 11 things are happening, they are signs that it's time to review the data in your vendor master file. What are the 11 things? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 399, 11 Signs It's Time to Clean Your Vendor Master File. So back in 2020, and I did have it up, but I don't remember now what the podcast episode number was, but it was back in 2020. So I was like, 6 years ago. And it was episode 110. So long time ago, but I did a podcast on 7 signs that it's time to clean your vendor master file. And then in February 2024, I don't know if you guys are connected with me on LinkedIn or not. I'll put a link in the description so you can. And if you want to, you can also sign up for my LinkedIn newsletter. But on the newsletter in February 2024, I had an article that was titled 8 Signs to Clean Your Vendor Master File. And so I had increased one, but today I have increased to 11. And so let's get started and talk about them. And number one, if you're having these signs, well, not number one in the list, but I just want to say before all of this, if you're having these signs, it probably means that you skipped cleaning your vendor master file at some point. I do recommend that you clean it at least quarterly, but I highly recommend you do it on a monthly basis because then you catch any issues without having a large volume of issues to catch at once. So if you wait to the end of the year, everything that happened that was wrong in the vendor master file, now you have to clean all of that up at the end of the year, not to mention the fact that if there are any changes to legal name, tax ID combinations that you notice because when you did the 10 match, the bulk upload, right, some of them were not successful. The validations didn't pass. Now you have, all the people that didn't match that if you'd have checked, right, didn't match in June, didn't match in July, didn't match in September, that you could have taken the time or someone could have taken the time to collect the information before it gets critical because a lot of folks will wait until the end of the year because they want to prepare for tax season that's going to start in January. And so if you do it every month, you won't have that much. It won't be as much a volume to clean up as it would if you just did it once a year and only, during the fourth quarter or at some point in December. And so I wanted to point out the timing of it. And then I also wanted to give you a resource because I do have a free training on 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. And so I will put that in the show notes as well. I think in the last few podcast episodes, I've done that. But I do that because in the summertime, I tend to talk more about cleaning the vendor master file because you may have time to do it. It might be a slower time of the year. But really, since I talk about doing it on a monthly basis, you really should be doing it every month. But uh, this is the time that I talk about it the most. I might talk about it in December too, or November, for those that haven't cleaned it that need to make sure that their information is valid for tax reporting as well. So anyway, make sure you check the show notes for the link if you like the free training on the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. All right, so let's start now with 11 signs it's time to clean your vendor master file. So the first one is you have duplicate payments. So duplicate payments can be caused by duplicate vendor records. And since accounting systems and ERPs only allow one invoice number per vendor record, eliminating the duplicate vendor records means that the same invoice cannot be paid to multiple vendor records for that same vendor. All right. And the second one is you have returned ACH payments or notice of changes. And so, did the vendor's bank account number change? Or did the vendor's bank merge or get acquired? So your ACH payment to the vendor will be returned, or you will receive a notice of change notifying you that while the payment may have been successful, a change had to be made to the banking information. And that means that if your vendor's bank was merged or got acquired, that it may have had the routing number change. So if you got a notice of change, that's probably what it is. Now the bank will make the change for you initially, right? But the expectation is that when you receive that notice of change, then you will go into your vendor master file and you will update that vendor record and potentially other vendor records that have that same branch or that same routing number because that same branch, right, would have been included in that merger or acquisition. And so you have to have a process around that because the bank will not continue to change that information, the routing number forever. At some point, it's going to turn into a returned payment because the expectation is that you are going to send valid banking details in your ACH file to the bank. And that probably should be a separate one too. But if you continue to send those banking details in your pay file, then the bank could file a violation with NACHA, the governing body over the US ACH network. And so that could bring you fines. And so another, sign with this one, return ACH payments, notice of changes, NACHA violations, can mean that you need to clean your vendor master file and update those bank routing numbers to make sure that they are up to date. Because again, banks do merge and get acquired, and that can change their routing number. So you need to update those in your vendor master file. All right. So the third one is so just like you can get returned ACH payments, this is return checks, maybe even return 1099, 1042 forms, or really any correspondence you send to the vendor. And that could be because, right, the addresses that are entered into the vendor master file are have not been standardized or formatted correctly so that it can be successfully mailed. All right, so number 4 is IRS notices for U.S. companies. The annual IRS tax filing is really no picnic to get through. I think I've talked about before how we used to generate about 30,000 1099s and 1042s when I was a practitioner. But finding out that your vendor's legal name and tax ID combination did not match IRS records records, that will trigger a B notice process. So you'll get the notification that it didn't match with CP 2100, CP 2100A notifications. And so now you've got to request that W-9 from your vendor and perhaps have to withhold on your vendor if they don't give it to you through the B notice process, which is just verbiage for a notice to your vendor. And that process, I know for us, was very manual. I don't know if you have an automated way to do that, but if you do, that's great. If you don't, it is, as you know, manual. But either way, it is work that should not have to be done because the legal name tax ID combination should have been caught with validation during the vendor cleanup process, and any that came back as unsuccessful, you should have had enough time to reach out to the vendor and get that information and get an updated W-9 in. I know some vendors, especially after you pay them, it's hard to do that, but you need to make sure that you try so you're not finding out at the time of the notice that the information was not valid. So that's another way to tell that you need to clean your vendor master file. The next one is if you have either internal fraud or external fraud. And so that's number 5. So both internal and external fraud means that you have somewhere invalid remit information in your vendor master file. Now, of course, you have it on the fraud that you found, but how long, has that been going on? Typically, when fraudsters find an organization where payment fraud is successful, they will target you again. And the one that you found, was that the first one? Was that number 3? Was that number 4? So was that number 10? So you do have to make sure that you are reviewing your vendor's data on a regular basis and making sure that you match remittance information. Now, this doesn't have to be done by you, but or anyone in your department, but you can give this, for example, to the IT team or the systems team and have them do a continuous monitoring on the payroll records or your employees reimbursement vendor records. If you have a separate reimbursement for expenses, a separate vendor record for employee expenses, have them check that against any vendor accounts and see if, a remittance address matches an employee's address. See if a bank account information matches employee's bank account. And I know they can go in there and because they know when the pay cycles are, so they will go in there, make the change, The employee will make the change, and then right after the pay cycle, go and change it back. Well, if you have a process in place where they are monitoring 24/7, like continuous monitoring, and then send notifications if they ever see a match, that will help catch internal fraud. And then another thing that will help catch not only internal fraud, but also external fraud as well, is to inactivate vendors that your company has not done business with in 15, 18, 24 months, whatever works for your company, because the less active vendors, the less vendors that are available for either internal or external fraud. All right, so that was number 5. And number 6 is undeliverable emails. And so vendor employees can, transition out to other companies. And that means that the contact email address, for example, you have on the vendor record may no longer be valid. And so, since those email addresses can be used for remittance documents and for change confirmations, they should be checked to confirm that they are still valid. Now, I don't necessarily condone looking for email addresses in some of these sites that that have them. I mean, if that's your policy, go for it. But what I would just make sure is that the vendor email addresses you have on file are valid, because if they're not valid, now you know you need to reach out to the vendor to update their information, to collect an updated email address. And there are tools that are available so that you can upload email addresses and just verify that they are still deliverable. Now, I will say that you do need to make sure that you're checking with, leadership, IT team, whomever you need to check with to make sure that you have permission to do that. All right. The next one is regulatory fines. So if you're getting regulatory fines, that may mean that you need to clean your vendor master file. So why? So if you filed a late correction with the IRS, and depending on when you filed it, you may be assessed some fines. But if you filed a late correction with the IRS because your vendor didn't receive their 1099 or 1042 in time, and that means that they couldn't notify you of a correction. That means it kind of points back to the returned 1099s, because you haven't, that was in part or number three, because you haven't cleaned your vendor master file, or your addresses are not formatted correctly. Now, I could have included this in, that number three, but I have it separately because there can also be another regulatory fine, and that is fines from the Department of Treasury because you paid a vendor that was on the OFAC list, for example. And so if you paid a vendor that was on a watch list, you could be assessed fines, penalties. And if it's OFAC, it's not only a civil penalty. It could be a civil penalty and a criminal penalty. So you definitely don't want to do that. And part of cleaning the vendor master file when you do it is to rerun your vendors against those watch lists, so that you can make sure you're not paying one that wasn't on the watch list when you first set them up, but now, right, they are on a watch list. And so those lists are not static. So you do want to make sure that if you do not have a continuous monitoring program or verification for watch lists, that you check or do this process. I recommend it on a monthly basis. And this is another reason why I recommend it on a monthly basis, because think about how many pay cycles you have. If you can't do it at the time of the pay cycle and it's a very manual process, then at the very least, it should be on a monthly basis, because at least you would check like every 30 days, and you wouldn't pay the vendor for longer than 30 days if they subsequently been added to a watch list. So that's another reason why I say on a monthly basis. If you waited to an annual basis, your fines could be very high if you paid a vendor that was subsequently added to a watch list. And then number eight is really a pet peeve, but I understand, right, from the vendor setup and maintenance point of view, or AP point of view, that it's not something that's under your control, but it's if you have blanket open purchase orders. And I get the blanket open purchase order thing. You don't have to keep, opening purchase orders. You just have a blanket open purchase order. But the problem is that you cannot inactivate a vendor that you haven't done business with, and again, 15, 18, 24 months, if they have an open purchase order. And so when I joined one company and we looked at the vendor master file, and there was a vendor that really hadn't had any invoices, really should have been inactivated, but there was a blanket open purchase order from, I don't know, years before. And so that was something that was kind of rampant in the purchasing team or department at that point. And that was something that we had to work with them so that they would not do, because I get it, right? They wanted to have a blanket open purchase order so they didn't have to keep doing, I don't know what you call them, revisions or whatever to the purchase order. But after a while, they really need to be closed. And I would say after a year, they need to be closed. Or when you know you're not going to do business with that vendor again, if it's early, if that at that point it's earlier, then you need to close that purchase order. But leaving them open just for convenience means that you have really inactive vendors that are still active, and the more active vendors you have, the more opportunity you have for both internal and external fraud. So if you have blanket open purchase orders, work with your procurement team to close them out, and then clean your vendor master file and activate those vendors that were only open because of those blanket purchase orders. All right. So number 9 is the auditors keep identifying vendor issues. So I do recommend that a vendor process audit be put in place. You do have to have desktop procedures documented. They need to be updated, but I do recommend you put that in place, because the internal controls, best practices, authentication techniques, vendor validations, everything that you put into place to avoid fraud, to avoid fines, to avoid bad vendor data, you have to make sure that the team is always following that process. And the best way to do it is with a vendor process audit. Now, it doesn't have to be done by external auditors. It could be your internal audit group. It could be someone that does not have access to the vendor master file. And the results of the audit identify things that are not being done correctly. Maybe let's go back to the addresses. They are not using the resource that you provided to standardize the address for mailing. Maybe they found that one team member was not using the vendor legal naming convention uh, standards that you have put into place. And so that means that, not just for the samples that the auditors pulled, but for all the other vendor records that those team members have created or updated need to be checked. And so that means you got to go back and you got to clean your vendor master file. All right. And so number 10 is internal employees complain that they can't find the correct vendor. So if you have a process for searching for vendors that the internal team members use, then you need to make sure that you're setting up the vendor master file in a way that will return the results. And so if you've told them to look for the tax ID, and they did and they couldn't find it, that could mean that tax IDs are being fingered. And so someone is just not paying attention when they type that information in. And so that could mean that you need to go back and you need to look at right, your vendor master file, because how many other records are that same way? Yes, I know you would catch it if you do the IRS bulk 10 match, but you can do that as a part of your vendor master file cleanup. All right. So, and it could be other things too. It could be the way that you've asked them to, if your system has something like a short name and you have a standard for how you enter in the short name. And so they search based on that standard. Well, if someone did not follow the standard, then they may not be able to find the vendor. All right. And then the last one, number 11. And this one actually requires that you're looking at your metrics on a regular basis, maybe monthly, and you find that your active vendor count keeps increasing. So when I was a practitioner, we had monthly AP metrics. And to be honest, at that point, we were not checking or tracking many metrics for the vendor process, but what we did track was duplicate vendors, and we also tracked active vendors. And so if the active vendors keep increasing, that could mean that you need to clean your vendor master file because inactive vendors are not being inactivated. And that is a step when you are cleaning your vendor master file. So if your active vendor count keeps increasing, then that could be that the vendor master file cleanup of your vendor master file has not been performed. And on that note, I do want to just, every time I talk about active vendor counts, I think about a conversation that I had, wow, years ago, 5, 8, I don't know, lots of years ago, where I was at a conference and I was still a practitioner at that time, and we were sitting in the session. And so for the vendor master file, we were all talking about how many vendors we had, how many active vendors. And so it was like a race. Well, how many vendors do you have? Well, how many vendors do you have? Right. And I had the 140,000 or some equivalent at that time. And so one person spoke up because, had more than I did, but they had 500 and I think 40,000 active vendors. And it was a government agency. I think it was like a uh, city, or I don't think it was a state. I think it was a city because that was drastically too many open or active vendors for a city to have of any size. And so that person did admit that one, they let the internal team members add vendors. And so, yeah, that vendor master file needed to be cleaned. And then two, that they never inactivated it. So they knew they had a problem. And I think one of the point of being in that session was to figure out how to fix it. But yeah, if you find that your active vendors are continuing to grow for no other reason, you might want to check when the last time that vendor master file cleanup was done. And if it's been a while, then go ahead and complete that 8-step process or whatever step process you have to clean it, and activate those vendors during that process. And then put that recurring, cleanup on a schedule, hopefully a monthly one. All right, so those are the 11 signs that it's time to clean your vendor master file. I'll go through them one more time. One is if you have duplicate payments. Two is if you have returned ACH payments or notices of change from your bank. Three is if you have returned checks, 1099, 1042 forms, or any other correspondence. Four is if you receive IRS notices indicating that the information you filed was not valid. Five is if you have internal or external fraud. Six is if you have undeliverable emails in your vendor master file. Seven is if you are assessed regulatory fines like OFAC or IRS. 8 is if you have blanket open purchase orders. 9 is if you have an audit in place and they keep identifying vendor record issues. 10 is employees complain that they can't find the correct vendor. And then 11 is your active vendor count keeps increasing. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 399th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.